Hi, my name's David Limbrick, and today I'm at the University of Melbourne. There's an event happening here today. It's the Marxism 2023 conference being hosted by self-described revolutionary socialist organisation, Socialist Alternative. And the reason that we're here is I've got two special guests with me today. I've got Paul Silverberg, who was a Liberal Democrats candidate in a few different elections. And I've also got my colleague from the upper house, Truong. He's the member for Western Metro for the Liberal Party in the upper house. And we're going to ask them about, rather than what we're talking about academically inside this conference here, we're going to talk about the lived experience of people who have experience with socialism, which Truong and Paul do. So, Paul, I'll go to you first. Paul, you grew up in the when you were a child in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, currently known as Russia, and tell us about your experience with socialism.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the opportunity to come out here and to have a chat to you, to Truong, and also to everybody who is listening. So, every communist regime in history had three distinctive parts. One, the building of it, which had the most atrocities. Second one is its relative stability, where a lot of rot happens. And the third one is when the people pay the bill. My personal experiences were about the part when the bill came due, and this is what I'll be focusing on today. So, in the late 80s and the early 90s, already communism was falling apart. But at the same time, almost until its dying breath, as kids, we were subject to the propaganda in schools. The first thing, in the very first school book, the very first page, had a picture of Lenin saying, "Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will live." The only museum to which I was taken in the first grade was a museum of the revolution. There was absolutely, even in that very, very terminal stage, there was no discussion of possibility that other ideas might be true. But that certainly wasn't the worst part of it all. The worst part that I've seen was economic and social impact, because all of the expenditures, all of the investment in heavy industry, not investing in people, came up with huge amount of shortages. I remember living and having a wonderful experience of having ration cards. And there was no war happening, there was no famine, there was no crop failures. I was living in the largest country in the world, which has enough land to feed probably half, if not 3/4 of the world. And yet there were shortages. Now, when you got your ration cards, it didn't actually mean that you were going to get things. So if you had your ration cards for soap, you'd walk to a shop. There was no guarantee there would be any soap there, or sugar for that matter. Now, if you had connections in the Communist Party at the time, that didn't apply to you. You had special shops, and you were more equal than others, and you had other privileges. The other part from the fall down of communism, one part that I'm particularly reminded of, was when there was a putsch happening or an attempted rebellion, and I was sitting in the school, and all of a sudden one of the teachers came in saying, "Well, there is a tank division heading into the city, but the fleet that was stationed, they said that they won't accept it, and if the tanks come into the city, they'll start shelling them." Problem was that I was kind of in that area around that where that might have happened. Luckily, it didn't come to that, but that's also what happens when regimes like that fall. And just very briefly, the worst part wasn't even any of that, is what came afterwards. It was the anarchy, it was the crime, it was the absolute tragedy of the entire USSR. Because once the communism fell down, and people starting to take what used to be public property into their own pockets, using the Communist Party cronies, using a huge amount of corruptions, and the law enforcement wasn't able to deal with any of it. It wasn't safe to walk down the streets. People were getting killed and robbed for as little as $20 in their pockets. And this is something that people don't talk about, but communism is directly responsible for. The headcount of victims from the 90s would be going into the millions. And I'm talking about people who suffered from the crime. The fact that male life expectancy in very short time fell by 15 years.
Wow.
15 years, from high 70s to early 60s. Nobody talks about it, but that's what happened when communism inevitably fails.
And Paul, what would you say to the people in there at the moment who are talking about, socialism and Marxism? What would you want to say to them?
Well, David, the first thing that I would say is I do believe that most people over there, their heart is in the right place about improving the plight of people. No society is perfect, no situation, certainly what we're living in is not perfect, so I absolutely applaud them for that. I applaud for having that feeling and ask them to keep that feeling. In terms of how to actually improve the plight of people, I would strongly recommend to read the history books. If you don't like reading history books and you feel they're biased, have a chat to people like Truong. Have a chat to me, to people who lived through it. If you don't like our politics, that's okay. There are plenty of apolitical people who live there. Talk to any Central European person. They'll tell you all about how much they loved the Soviets and how much they loved the communism. They like them even less than I do. And as a closing thought, one of the reasons why it's very appropriate that Marxism is done in the university and this conference, it's all very, very theoretical. And that's perhaps why academia does like it so much, and so many in academia feel that that is the right thing to do. It also reminds me of a little thing in finance called the efficient market theory, that as a basis assumes that everybody in the stock market has the same level of information at all times, which is absolutely ludicrous. Do you really think that you or me could have exactly the same information as a hedge fund manager in New York? Well, Marxism is exactly the same.
Great, thank you, Paul. And I'd like to ask Truong. So Truong grew up as a child in Vietnam, and what's your experience with socialism as a child?
Thanks, Dave. No, thanks for having me, and nice to meet Paul today. My experience basically grew up in a communist country, and after the fall of Vietnam in 1975, you understand there's communism and there's socialism, and what people say that there's two different things. It isn't really. Socialism is basically equality, they preach for equality and the spread of wealth. Well, once people want to start spread their wealth, take their wealth, people are reluctant to actually give up what they own and what they have, and that's where communism comes in. Let's use oppression, violence, and violence to obtain what your wealth is. So that is the lead on socialism to communism. And after the fall of Saigon, you understand the ideology is basically spread the wealth in the name of community, equality of community. And what people have for decades, they're earning their wealth that they build up, they work hard, and what communism basically is confiscate what people's properties, people's wealth. And who determine that? It's not the community, it's a very group of people who decide who is wealthy and who's not. And that's what happened in my experience lesson to communism after the fall of Saigon. So from their determinations, every family who had educated, who had some sort of wealth, housing, were taken away. So anyone had educations, were in the professions, listened to the government. Prior to 1975, they were gone to re-education camp, and those who belong in the army, who fought against the war, goes in there. And like part of my house was confiscated. We live upstairs, and downstairs were given away to the government. Government takes over it, and they decide who and which people decides listen to where your wealth is distributed. So that's where the difference between the same link between socialism, what is preaching here at the moment now, and communism. And when we listen to people disagree with them, they move on to oppression and subject to violence, listen to how get their way of mean, relation to how they approach their ideology. So as you were after 1975 towards the 80s, a lot of millions of people from Vietnam flee the country of communism. So that's my lived experience lesson, and I listen to what it affects my family and millions of people who have fled Vietnam. Listen to their freedom, it's gone, taken away, the individual freedoms taken away, liberties taken away. Listen to for the benefit of community, for the benefit of overall society. But who decides that? Not the community, but a very group of people who are in charge. So that's my lived experience. Listen to communism and socialism, David.
Yeah, and of course, many Vietnamese that fled came to Australia. I think it was the Liberal Party that allowed that,
Yes.
wasn't it? Yeah. So what would your message be to the people in there talking about socialism today?
And I'll also touch base, listen to, we're very grateful to the Liberal Party in 1975, Malcolm Fraser, under Malcolm Fraser, who actually opened a floodgate for Indochina refugees who have come to Australia. So most Vietnamese who've actually fled during those years recognise that, and we acknowledge that, and we still remember that to this day.
Yeah, I've been to lots of Vietnamese community events in Southeast Metro, and they always talk about Fraser.
Yeah, so just go back to your question to the people here. Like Paul said, people come here today. Today is Easter weekend. Most holiday, and it's a month of around. It's most precious. You should be home, your family, but they're here on their own right and their own time because of their intention of good for people, good for society, and I acknowledge that, and that they have good intention. But listen to, since they've been here, took enough time to come here on their own time, I urge them to actually not just stop here, but search further, do their own research, be diligent, listen to what it is socialism is all about. Listen to the history, read a history book, speak to people who have experience from different culture, from Asia, from Europe, and even South America. Speak to those people. There's heaps of people here in Victoria, multicultural, that came here because of that very reason of like communism and socialism oppression. So speak to them, and they'll explain to you what their experience is all about. Then from then you have a wider knowledge of what's going on, what socialism is all about, and what it is all about. Don't just listen and then you start preaching it. Listen to those lived experience and use your education, use your knowledge, and then make up your mind what is socialism all about. So that's my word to them, David.
Thank you, Truong. And I think Paul and Truong have made some really good points. And look, I acknowledge that having a lot of these people, they have their heart in the right place. They have good intentions, right? But ultimately what matters is consequences, not intentions. And that's what we're concerned about. So I think, these intentions or outcomes that they want can't be enacted without suppressing people's individual liberties and rights. And that's what we've seen whenever this has been enacted throughout the world, both in the USSR and in Vietnam and many other places throughout the world. And I just thought that it's important that if this type of discussion is happening in Melbourne, it can't go unchallenged without listening to the lived experience of people who've experienced socialism themselves. So thank you very much for watching this, and thank you to Truong and Paul for sharing your experiences today.
Thank you for having us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.